Israel's government is preparing a plan to fully occupy the Gaza Strip, despite objections from top military staff. The plans come at a time when Israel appears increasingly divided over the future of the war on Gaza, concerned about the fate of the remaining captives, combat fatigue in the army, and its international reputation. Cracks grew after hundreds of former security and intelligence officials called for an end to the war in a letter sent to US President Trump, and after Hamas released videos of emaciated Israeli captives, roughly 50 of whom are still in the Strip, 20 of them believed to be alive. With the plan set to last 4 to 5 months, international outrage is also growing at scenes of mass starvation in Gaza, with demands for an overhaul of the GHF aid system. To discuss these latest developments and how Israel's public is thinking about the ongoing war is Israeli journalist and author Gideon Levy. Gideon, thank you so much for being here to speak with us today. So, Gideon, we've heard that Israel's cabinet is deciding tonight, in an hour actually, on a plan to fully occupy Gaza, despite these apparent tensions between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel's military chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, over the plan itself. Could you just explain a little bit about why there seems to be this disagreement over the next phase of the war?
I'm not sure there is such a disagreement. Time will show. I think the chief of the army knows very well that his army is exhausted from 22 months of, I don't want to call it fighting because it was not really fighting, but occupying parts of Gaza. And he might also ask himself, what is the goal now? In the same time, it might also be only to keep himself an alibi if it will fail, and it will definitely fail, then he can claim that he was against. Those things are not very clear. And they don't matter so much. What really matters is that the cabinet will accept Netanyahu's plan and the army will commit Netanyahu's plan, and we will face a new reality in the Gaza Strip, which will be much worse than what we saw until now. And what we saw until now was hell.
And you've mentioned obviously this fatigue after 22 months of war. Obviously, we've seen reports of climbing suicide rates among Israeli soldiers. Answers to draft calls are decreasing. So does the Israeli public still have the readiness, the appetite to fight that it had at the start of the war on 7th of October 2023? Has public willingness ebbed at all?
It did change, but I'm afraid that if there will be an order to go for this operation, there will be very few who will not join it. It is part of the Israeli DNA to obey, to do whatever the army tells you to do without asking too many questions, even if you are risking your life or the lives of your children for nothing. And still the vast majority of Israelis will follow it. In the margins, there will be here and there those who will find a way out of it, but it will not stop the operation.
And speaking of risking lives, obviously a big part of the concern with this plan is that it allows for offensive operations even in areas where Israeli captives are held in the Strip. And obviously the families of captives have spoken out against this. What do you see happening with the remaining captives? Is this kind of Netanyahu saying we've given up on plans for a captive release deal, or where does Israeli society stand on that?
The sentiment, the national sentiment, almost of all Israelis, not all of them, but most of them, is obviously to release the hostages in any price, in any case. But Netanyahu quite ignores it. For him, from the beginning, the hostages were not the first priority. And now it comes to a stage in which Netanyahu's priorities are totally different, namely to conquer Gaza. He knows that the chances that they will survive another round of bloodshed in the places where they are located is very small. And still he goes for it because for him, the big goal of ethnic cleansing of Gaza, pushing all the population to the south, and then maybe one day kicking them out of the Gaza Strip is much more important than 20 living Israelis.
And so you think, the deprioritizing the captives, do you see that as Netanyahu catering to his base? Obviously, we saw recently this kind of settlers' march of return to Gaza, led by Daniela Weiss and similar figures known to be close to the prime minister. Do you see this plan now for a full takeover of Gaza? Do you see it as him signaling kind of to that settler right that this is for you and I have your interests at heart?
I'm not sure that it is for them, but it is for his political survival. He knows that he needs them. He doesn't have a government without them. And maybe also I can give him the credit that he believes that that's the solution, this final victory that he keeps on speaking about, namely to make Gaza Jewish, to settle Jews in Gaza, to enlarge the colonialistic Israel, and he believes it is possible. I think that it is criminal, obviously, but I truly believe that there is a chance that he thinks that that's the solution.
And obviously, under the previous U.S. President Biden, he'd said that permanent occupation and resettling Gaza was a red line. Obviously, the current President Trump seems far more lenient, shall we say, and has been open to different ideas of a takeover of the Strip. Do you see, potential plans for a permanent occupation and efforts to resettle Gaza as receiving any pushback from the U.S., especially under President Trump?
Nothing to see. It's a matter of fact. Donald Trump said that it's about Israel and Netanyahu to decide. He gave Israel a green light to commit any possible crime against humanity. He said that it's up to Israel. What do you need more than this? My speculations are worth nothing when the American president says this is up to Israel. He might change his mind. That's another thing. But right now, Israel has a green light to go for it.
In some ways, then, the greatest criticism or pushback to Netanyahu's plans has come from within Israel itself. Last week, we saw hundreds of ex-security and intelligence heads in Israel kind of send a letter to Trump and also put out a video calling on Prime Minister Netanyahu to end the war, saying it wasn't achieving any strategic objectives, saying it was jeopardizing kind of Israel's future on the international stage. What do you see as the impact of that statement? Obviously, this is coming from, very well-known establishment figures in Israel. Do you think it had an effect on support for the war among the Israeli public?
Unfortunately not, because they are not from Netanyahu's base. They are critical about Netanyahu from the beginning of his term, and for sure from the beginning of this war. Their voice is important. They might encourage other people to join the resistance to the war. But by the end of the day, those voices will not stop Netanyahu because he's a very, very political human being. And he knows that those people will never support him, whatever he does. So why should we listen to them? For him, they can be ignored like he ignores the protests and the demonstrations. Those demonstrations, which take now more than 2 years because they started before the war, the demonstrations against him are, by the end of the day, to be very frank, quite meaningless because they don't have an effect, because Netanyahu's base is very solid, even if it's not the majority, but it's very solid, much more solid than the other camp. They know exactly what they want. They believe in Netanyahu really blindly. They will follow him blindly and support him blindly. And that's a very, very strong and solid political base. And now Netanyahu makes this base even stronger by offering them the biggest fantasy they had, to resettle and reconquer Gaza. What's better than this for them for the time being? So right now, all those petitions and demonstrations are very important, but they don't have an immediate effect, not at all.
Like you said, that base seems to be unmoving, and they seem to be ignoring those traditional establishment voices, even clashing with them at times. We saw them accusing these figures of a coup, or by the Attorney General or by the Chief of Staff or by all these traditional figures in Israeli society, and they seem quite fixed in their position, like you said, and only to have grown. At the same time, you have these very critical voices. Are these divisions kind of unprecedented in Israeli politics? Has Israeli society ever been as kind of divided and polarized as this in the past? Or have these been kind of accentuated by the war of the past 22 months?
No, it's not unprecedented, because I remember times in which it was maybe even worse. I have some doubts about the assumption that the Israeli society is so divided. By the end of the day, the big majority of Israelis support the occupation. By the end of the day, they all, not all, but the big majority supports the apartheid. By the end of the day, they even support the war. They just want to see the hostages being released and less soldiers killed. But if it's about a war with less killed soldiers, most of those protests have no sentiment toward Gaza and couldn't care less about the genocide in Gaza, which should have been the main source of resistance now. This war should be fought, first of all, because of the genocide, and then all the other things. Not for this camp. This camp sees it differently. And therefore, I think that when you come to look at the picture as a whole, Israel society, against all the descriptions you get in the media, is much more united than you think. Because on the core issues, they agree. They don't agree over Netanyahu. They don't agree over the hostages. But the core issues, you think that any other candidate who will replace Netanyahu will put an end to the occupation, will deal with it at all? Any other candidate would even admit that there is an apartheid in Israel? Not at all.
And just coming back to that point on the captives, about which so many in Israeli society are so concerned. Obviously, recently we saw this shocking video released by Hamas showing them to be emaciated. This is under Israel's blockade of Gaza, and as mass starvation is spreading, and obviously we've seen the captives looking very frail. How have those videos been received in Israeli society? Is the majority of the anger still with Hamas? Do any of them blame the Prime Minister himself in terms of access to food and in terms of rescuing these captives, obviously beyond the families themselves?
Both. Both is true. There is a lot of anger and frustration and solidarity also with the families, I must say, and pain. Israelis look at those young people with a lot of emotions. It's very emotional. What they don't see is that there are thousands of Palestinians who are in quite similar situation now in Gaza. What they don't see is that there are hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who are in quite similar situation in Israeli prisons. This they don't see. But them they see with a lot of empathy and mercy and solidarity, and really people are really heartbroken about the issue of the captives, of the hostages.
And as you said, a lot of that sympathy is for the captives, very little for Palestinians. We saw a recent poll suggesting that 79% of Jewish Israelis aren't particularly troubled by the starvation of Palestinians. I wonder, though, are they troubled by the growing international criticism? Obviously, they'll very readily dismiss kind of aid groups and rights groups as, exaggerating or being unfair on Israel. But surely criticism might reach a point where it's harder to ignore or brush off?
First of all, it reached already this point. Israelis hesitate now. I mean, they are going abroad, but with a lot of concern. They know they might face, and they are facing already, quite unpleasant incidents everywhere. Wherever they go, in any restaurant they enter, they might be kicked out. It's not very pleasant. So it is already here. Israel is already a pariah state, and it can become much more if this war will continue. The Israelis have a very good shield to protect themselves of this, namely to blame the world. The world is anti-Semitic, and therefore it's not our fault. It's their fault. Look how they hate us. Whatever we do, they will hate us. We are the victims. And very soon again, the discourse is of victimization. Israel is a victim. Israelis who go to a restaurant and the owners send them away are victims of anti-Semitism. They don't think about the possibility that maybe those waiters who kick them out from a restaurant are people of conscience who see what they don't see from Gaza and say, you are accountable, you must be taken accountable for those horrible scenes, and we don't want to see you here. We don't want to host people who are committing a genocide in Gaza. This very few Israelis accept.
And I suppose for a section of Israeli society and perhaps Netanyahu's base, for them, concerns of international image or reputation will always be subservient to, primarily ideological concerns about, settling territory, whether it be in the occupied West Bank or Gaza. I imagine then it's just not as much of a concern, of a worry for them compared to their main goals.
Look, it's not, this is true, because first of all, they're also less, those hardcore settlers and right-wingers go less abroad, care much less about the world, know much less about the world, have much less interest about the world. Their only concern is the Jewish people and Israel. Those are their focuses. And don't forget that as long as the United States, as a state, not public opinion, but as long as the American administration continues to supply Israel with everything, from political support to military and economically support, Israel can go on. The real critical moment, and then everyone will have to understand that something is changing, will be when this administration or the next one will say enough is enough. We are right now very far from this.
And as you know, that state support is vital. Netanyahu himself at times has been, something of a political chameleon, or at least that's how he's seen, a man who can liaise with the US, with international countries and so on. But now he seems to be taking quite a hard line and really embracing that right-wing support, unconditionally. Do you see that as the mark of an ideological change in the prime minister? Do you see it as, reflective of most of Israeli society? Or do you see it as, as some more cynical observers have pointed out, the idea that this war and other wars across the region, Iran, Syria, have been considered somewhat essential for him in order to avoid, the mounting corruption investigations and trials going on against him?
That's a question that nobody can answer because none of us can really get into his mind. I am one of the few who think that there is ideology behind it, and it might be not neither nor, but both. It can be a mixture of both. On one hand, his personal ambitions and personal interests. On the other hand, his ideology. It can be a mixture of both of them, and I believe it is a mixture of both of them. Which one is more dominant, it's hard to tell. But in any case, he is now committed to the right-wingers. If he does it from belief or from cynical interest, it doesn't matter so much. He is now taking Israel and taking Gaza to horrible new places.
Yeah. And I guess then on that note, he's chosen this direction. I wonder, I think the potential date for the next elections are 2026. And, there's some conjecture about when he might choose to schedule those as best suited for him. Will Israeli society follow Prime Minister Netanyahu in that direction? Do you think, there is a political alternative which can reasonably confront him? Or do you think at the moment he kind of is the only real political path that represents the country?
It's very hard to tell because, as you said, it will be in 26, and then 26 until 26, many things can happen and many things can change also. I can only say two things. First of all, he proved in the past that against all odds, he won elections. And secondly, that right now the polls show that he is still the most appreciated or beloved politician, but he doesn't have a majority in the parliament. He will not have a government. If the polls are right and if the elections take place today, he doesn't have a government. So time will show. Right now, the alternative is very pale, and what bothers me and concerns me much more, that practically there is not a real alternative, as I tried to explain before. Things will be better, but the core issues will remain the same. And therefore, I don't have too many hopes for replacing Netanyahu.
So if the hope is in not in Netanyahu, then just to close, how do you see this war ending? If you do see it ending, if that's not going to come from Netanyahu and not necessarily inside Israel, we're nearly at the 2-year mark of this war. What do you think it will take to end it?
It will take an intervention of the international community. Without this, it will not end. And when I say international community, obviously it's first of all the United States, but not only. We know how the apartheid system in South Africa came to its end, and we will need the same ways and the same methods also with the second apartheid state. In any case, unless Donald Trump wakes tomorrow morning and really changes his all priorities, which will bring an end. I mean, Donald Trump can bring an end to this war within days if he just wants. And I don't know how to make him wanting this. And it might happen because he's so unexpected. He can turn against Netanyahu very easily, and then it will end. But if Donald Trump and his administration will continue to support the war and Netanyahu, then the role is really on the international community in actions, not in condemnations, not in recognition of a Palestinian state. All those things are meaningless. They are not meaningless, but they will not stop the war. The only thing that can stop the war is when Israel will realize it cannot go on. And this depends much on the international community.
So bold action from the international community, the only way out. Gideon Levy, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Appreciate your insights as always, and thank you so much for tuning in.